Welcome, everybody. I'm going to talk about responsive web design for developers. And, well, let's start with a question first. How many of you are working for a web agency who has like an art director and some web designers? Okay, only one, so that's pretty good for this session at least. And I mean, the rest of you are doing web development, but you have to figure pretty much out yourself how to make it look good and do the look and feel of your application, I guess. So, well, that is the reason to do this session, because I have been working for a web agency for about 10 years, and I had like to deal with art directors and web designers, and I'm like a technical guy, and I can promise you one thing: those people are a special piece of work. I mean, they are very difficult to work with, and the reasons for having such difficulties with those people is that if we would take a look at the brains of a developer, it would probably look something like this. So if we would cut open our head and we look inside, we'll see something like this. And this is more or less like creative, but these guys, these are all people, in case you didn't notice. They can do this any time of the year, any minute of the day. They can make these pretty pictures all day long. But if we would take a look at the brains of a designer, it will probably look something like this. And I mean, this can be done only once. It depends on the wind, it depends on the rain, it depends on the position of the moon, I don't know, whatever. If you ask a designer to do this a second time, it's going to look different. And well, for a lot of things that's good, but yeah, for us that is typically quite difficult, because we want to do it in like a structured way, and we want to, yeah, reproduce certain things a number of times. So, in case you have not, you don't have to deal with those kind of brains, there are a couple of things that we can do to make our sites or our web applications basically look better. Without going into Photoshop and doing all kinds of crazy things with graphics and so on. So, before we go into a bit of coding, I will do a bit of live coding, and I will show you a bit about CSS and how to make your website look responsive. That is something which is yeah, pretty obvious these days. It has to look good on all devices, small and big ones. I'm going to show you a couple of tricks on how that works. But before we do, I'll first show a couple of trends that you see these days on websites. And one of the things that is pretty popular these days is big scalable background photography. And well, I've got one of our own demo sites, which is a small hotel site, and I can switch over to the live site as well. It did change recently slightly, but it still has the idea of big scalable photography. Because what happens is, if we make this site a bit smaller, you'll see that it will still look good, and things got rearranged a bit. You can obviously get those images from a number of websites. You can purchase those images. You have to be careful with all the things that I'm showing. You have to be careful about copyright issues, but I'll speak a bit about it a bit later. You can acquire those images, or you can make them yourself. But you'll see this quite a bit. And what you see these days is that there are personalized images as well, which is, for instance, with big rotating banners and the photography. And if you take a look at this site is actually designed by one of my friends, and she is a designer, but she is also pretty much into responsive CSS and all those kind of tricks. And what you see here is that they actually hired a photographer to take a couple of pictures of the people actually working on this company. Don't mind the text. I'm from Holland, so this is a Dutch site. But if you take a look at this site, this is one of the better responsive sites, I do have to say. Because what happens here is they've got like this nice big image, but once I start resizing this site, and you take a look at the position, this is a site where you can search for vacancies and job openings and stuff like that. But once I resize this site, you'll see that things start to rearrange. You'll see that the search box gets smaller, and if I make it even smaller for a phone or whatever, you'll see that the navigation changed, the form disappeared, it moved all the way to the bottom. So this is actually a pretty advanced example of responsive web design. But you'll see that we can do that ourselves. I mean, she spent quite some time on getting this all working perfectly. But you'll see that the navigation changed, the position of elements changed, and this is all being done with CSS3 and media queries, which I will talk about a bit later. And the interesting thing is that nothing is being repainted, or there is not performed any JavaScript at this stage. This is all being done by CSS. So this is really fast because the browser knows how to deal with CSS. And yeah, this is an excellent example of a responsive site. So another thing that you see here and there, I would not advise you to go into this. This is typically something which is used on design agency websites, but I thought it is still cool to show because this is what's possible with CSS these days. Does anybody know what parallax scrolling is? Only one. Well, I've got a perfect example because as with a couple of things in current web development, ideas have been taken out of video gaming from the early 80s and the Super Nintendo games and stuff like that. And here you see one of those games, and this is an excellent example of parallax scrolling. What you see is that the game is actually divided into a couple of layers. So you've got the big mountain on the back, you've got like some smaller mountains on the front, and you've got the action figure all the way on the front. But what you see is that those layers, they shift at different speeds. So the back layer with the big mountain and the clouds, they move slower as the layer in front of it. And the action figure even goes faster. And that gives you an impression of 3D on your site. And as I mentioned, this is something which can be applied on websites as well, but you'll need some serious photography or some elements on it. So this is being done on some more web design agency related sites. But one of the examples that uses this as well, which is not a web agency, is the Space Needle side of the Seattle Space Needle. So let me open that one up. Well, this is actually a pretty long needle in the sky, so this would be an excellent example for parallax scrolling. And what you see here is that if I scroll down, you see different elements move at different speeds. You see? And this will give you an impression on that it is 3D. And well, what you do see is that you need like some specific photography in this case. So for us as developers, I would not go this bad, but this will show you the power of CSS3, what is being used heavily on this site, together with a bit of JavaScript. So these are some things that you see on the more modern websites. But let's talk a bit more about some things that we can use these days. And I will first start with something which is introduced in CSS3, which is called downloadable fonts. Before CSS3, we only had the availability of a number of fonts which were also available on the computer or the device of the visitor of the site. So you could have like Arial, Courier, Verdana, and a couple of other fonts. But those fonts need to be available, so they need to be installed on the computer that you're browsing the web. So in case your company has like some corporate ID with some style guides, etc., and they use a specific font, you couldn't be using that font because it needs to be installed on the workstation or on the device. But with CSS3, we can use custom downloadable fonts. And what that means is that we can put the font definition file on the web server. It will be downloaded on the client machine temporarily. And you could have that font of your company, which is used in all their communication. You could use that in your site as well. And well, this is just a little example of a couple of fonts that are not available on all machines by default. So this is something that you could use. And this could be one of the things to make your site a bit more into the look and feel of the corporate identity of the company that you're working for. I mean, most companies will have some style guide which defines which fonts they're using, which colors, which logos, etc., etc. This could be something to be used. So if you want to use this downloadable fonts thing, there is another thing with the fonts, but I'll come to that in a couple of minutes. If you want to have this available on your site, you need to have 3 font definitions to support all major browsers. So you will have a WOFF file, which has the font definition, how all the characters look. You will need to have an EOT in case you're still supporting some older Explorer versions. And you will also need a TTF, which is a TrueType font, for Firefox, Chrome, Opera, and some other browsers. I would warn you because it might cause copyright issues. And I can tell you that if you find a font somewhere on your local machine, for instance, and you want to make that available on the web server, you have to be careful that it is allowed with that font. I can promise you that if you are putting that font on the server, the author of that font will find you, and he will notice you. I had a project in the past, and that was like, I still wonder how they found it. I was working for a company, and we had to create some kind of a microsite where you could win a prize, which were tickets to a concert of, I think it was Justin Bieber or something. And the agency who delivered all the content to us, they just Googled a couple of images of Justin Bieber. They sent it over to us. They bought a couple of tickets with some ticketing agency, and that was the prize. So we put up that site. The site was live for like 2 hours. We got a message from the management of Justin Bieber. You have images on your site. That's not going to work. Yeah, but people are going to win a prize, which are tickets to Justin Bieber. Take those images off. They found it. I mean, I was working in Holland. It was a Dutch agency, and they found it within an hour. So they will find those fonts as well. So be careful with that. But there are obviously solutions for this. If you want to go that path, here's, by the way, how you would declare that in CSS, but I'll show you a bit later because I'm going to show you a small example where we will use a custom font, which is copyright free, so you can use that. So what you basically do in CSS is that you will define a font family, you give it a name, and you specify those 3 formats that I was mentioning earlier. And then it will be available under the font family name that I specified there in CSS. But you'll see a bit later how that works. So getting back to the copyright thing, there is a solution for that, which is Google Web Fonts. Let me get back. I was a bit too fast. The thing with the Google Web Fonts is that they have a huge collection of fonts, but you have to check that out because fonts normally have a name which is kind of universal. Like Verdana, if you search for a font Verdana, it will look like Verdana anyway. What they did with Google is they changed names, but the fonts are still looking the same. So for instance, if you want to use Verdana or some other font like, I'm not really a font kind of guy, but you have to find the alternative which looks the same. So they use a bit of different names to overcome copyright issues and stuff like that. The website of Google Fonts is actually quite simple to get onto because if you just look for Google Web Fonts or Google Fonts, yeah, that was not. You will have on this site available a huge collection of fonts in all forms and shapes. And if you want to have one of those fonts available on your site, you can just select it by adding this button. Add a couple of more fonts maybe, and then here you see how to import those fonts into your own site by just putting this in the head, and the font will be available. It's just as simple as that. In this case, it will be named as Railway, because I was now doing the Railway font, I think. So if I specify in my CSS somewhere a font family Railway, it will use this font. So it's pretty simple to get started with this. I would be a bit cautious by not going completely mad with those fonts, because yeah, the choice of fonts is normally being done by some of these brains. So, I mean, if you have specifications, you can just try to use it, or if not, I would keep it safe. But another thing that comes with the custom fonts is something which is more interesting for us, because how many of you like doing stuff in Paint or Photoshop or making like little images? No one. I knew that. Another thing which comes with this is the use of icon fonts. Somebody came up with the idea, okay, so now we have custom fonts, which are basically all vector definitions on those characters. But what if I create a specific font which will have little icons or vector graphics, icons, glyphs, instead of characters A, B, C? So that is something which is pretty useful for us, because we didn't like to paint. There are a couple of providers which provide you with icon fonts, and they are basically these kinds of little symbols. For instance, an Amazon logo, or a battery logo, or a calendar, or they've got plenty of it. And there are actually a couple of providers of those icons, so you don't even need to draw them yourself. You can just go to one of those sites. And in this case, I'll be showing the Icon Moon one, which is a pretty familiar one. You also have something called Font Awesome, which is like something similar as this. What you can do here is you can actually select a whole bunch of icons yourself and have this site create a font definition for you. They have all kinds of stuff. So, for instance, if I go to the library here, you will have an enormous amount of all kinds of images here. And you can find anything you like, and you can have this site have a font file composed for you. You can put it on your web server, link it in exactly the same way as we did with the fonts, and you can use these little icons instead of drawing them all by yourself. One of the things is, because a font definition is a vector formatted definition of those characters, the same applies to those icons. They are vector-based images. And that means that if I want to have it bigger, it will remain crisp and clear. It will not lose any quality, because they are not bitmaps or JPEGs anymore. No, they are vector-drawn images. So they will always be sharp, and they will always look good. There is obviously one thing that you should be aware of, or basically two. Because this is basically a font has two colors, a background and a foreground. The same applies to those little, to those icons. They only are in two colors available. You can change colors really easy by changing the font color or the background color. You can change one of those colors in HTML or CSS. But if you need more colors on those images, then the font icons will not suit you, because they have a foreground and a background. That's about it. Another thing is, it could happen that for some reason this font file can't be downloaded. So somebody is on a really crappy internet connection, he opens up his browser, he goes to your site, that font needs to be downloaded, obviously. If for some reason that font file cannot be served or it cannot be downloaded, you won't have images. It's just not going to be there. So you need to have a kind of a fallback mechanism for that. And with those IQ Moon and Font Awesome sites, they provide you with some good alternatives. So as I mentioned, the size, the colors, they're just going to be specified. Well, you also have to make sure that the minimum browser supports the web fonts, because not the older browsers might have some problems with this. And you have to do the fallback. So you can do that by using something called Modernizer to determine which browser supports this. Or you can have a fallback mechanism of an image sprite which contains all those images. And those sites that I was mentioning, they will provide you with a sprite with CSS things in there as well. So you can still have a fallback mechanism. So talking about the Modernizer, has anybody used Modernizer? Sort of, or you're just linking it in and it's being done by Visual Studio, so I'm just using it. Does anybody know what it does, actually? Well, Modernizer is like a really cool thing to determine what capabilities your browser has. And the most easy way to show that is the only thing Modernizer does, it runs a small piece of JavaScript at the loading of your page. And what it does is best to be shown in a screenshot of, in this case, Firebug. You see a whole bunch of CSS selectors on the HTML node of this document. And these nodes, or these classes, they have been added by Modernizer. So Modernizer is a small piece of JavaScript. It runs at page load, and it will add a number of those tags here. And for instance, if you want to know if your browser supports SVG, which is a vector-based graphics format, in this case, the browser supports SVG because it just rendered that tag in. Does this browser support CSS gradients? Yes, it does. So whenever the browser does not support SVG, this one will be left out. So this is basically the only thing that Modernizer does. So all the major features of the browser are being rendered out as CSS selectors. So if I would now create a CSS selector SVG, that will only be done if the browser supports SVG, but you'll see a bit later how that can be applied. So this is what Modernizer does. So this is an excellent tool to determine what capabilities your browser has concerning all kinds of features that you can use in the design of your site. Well, I was talking a bit about responsive web design, and it's the title of this session. So I'm not going to read this. I mean, responsive web design is creating a website which will look good on all the different devices that we have these days. Whether it is a phone or a tablet or a desktop computer or a laptop, it should rearrange itself depending on the device you're looking at. So how could that be done? Well, this is basically a screenshot which shows you like, okay, so on a big screen it's going to look like that, but on a small screen I'm going to put everything below each other. And in a nutshell, that is what can be done with things like Bootstrap or some other positioning frameworks. So, yeah, positioning frameworks, CSS frameworks, that is something that you should use to make sure that your site looks good on any browser, on any device. And, well, if we take a look at those frameworks, I would urge you to take one of those frameworks, whether it is Bootstrap or something else. There are a couple of other ones as well, and Bootstrap is quite popular these days. I'll talk a bit about Bootstrap, why it is so popular. There are obviously a lot of designers familiar with Bootstrap, and it's got a whole bunch of stuff there. It might not always be good, because how many of you are using third-party controls from DevExpress or Telerik or anything else? Yeah, quite a few. So that might be an issue, or that might cause a bit of extra work, because you might need to have the controls that come from the component vendor to be looking in the same style as Bootstrap. So that might be a reason not to use Bootstrap. At the other end, it's widely used, and it's really easy to find somebody to work with Bootstrap as a developer. Another one which is quite popular, but not as popular as Bootstrap, is Foundation, and it supports pretty much the same features as Bootstrap. It's got some modular tools, as you can see, and its architecture is slightly different. But what you do see is that it supports a grid system, and that is the same what Twitter is using as well. The last one I want to show, because I'm going to do a bit of work on this one, is Skeleton CSS. Is anybody familiar with Skeleton? It's a really small framework. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles of Twitter, but for me, it gives me a good starting point to show you what we can do for responsive web design. So I'm going to use the Skeleton one, but I mean the same principles apply to Bootstrap and Foundation and any other grid system as well. So how do they work? I'll get to that a bit later, because I'm going to first tell you, I have to move this slide. I'm going to be doing a bit of coding in Visual Studio 2015. I'm going to use the the Visual Studio Web Essentials plugin. Anyone familiar with those? Yeah, not too much. Okay, so if you're doing CSS, HTML, less JavaScript, I don't know, whatever, Web Essentials is really a good help. But you'll see that in a minute. It's downloadable for free. You can install and use it for free as well, and it's absolutely for web development something you should use. I will be using a browser. In this case, I'll probably be using Firefox or Chrome, because most browsers have good developer tools. So getting back to the CSS positioning, all of those systems, Bootstrap, Foundation, Skeleton, they use a grid for positioning. And there are a couple of differences between those grids, but in essence, it works like this. The CSS grid system lays out a number of columns. In this case, it lays out 12 columns across your page. And that means that you can span elements across those columns. If the page gets wider because you're resizing your browser or you are looking at it on a different device, the columns get wider. If the screen gets smaller, the columns get smaller. And at a certain stage, you can do some things on that. So we have the columns. In this case, we picked 12 because it's dividable by a large amount of numbers. You can divide it by 3 or 4 or 2 or whatever. Some other grids use 16 columns, so those are differences between, for instance, Bootstrap, Skeleton. One uses 12, the other one uses 16, but we've got a bunch of columns. And then down those columns, we have bands or rows laid down. Inside those rows, we are putting elements. And what is interesting here is that you'll see that we have a div which has a class with the name 4, and we've got another one with the name of 8. And everything in one row should add up to 12 in this case. If you would have a grid with 16 columns, then you would have a class 4 and you would have a class 12. So it will add up to the amount of columns that's there. Well, then you can lay down a number of those rows. So it's a bit like reporting. You lay down a couple of rows, you put some content in there. In this case, we'll have like a div which spans 12. And we've got some more, and you can create all kinds of variations here. You can knock yourself completely out here. And what happens if the screen gets smaller, elements will collapse or drop down or will hide out. So I could say that, for instance, if my screen gets smaller at a certain stage, I want that class 8 on the first row to disappear completely. That can be done with CSS3. Or I want to just have it below the class 4. So those elements will stick together, or they will at least be inside that row as a container, and they will span across those 12 columns. So that is basically the baseline of responsive web design, and this is how this is going to work. So I'm going to switch over to my Visual Studio here with the things that I just shown you. So I've got Visual Studio, I've got Web Essentials installed, and I have in this case downloaded the skeleton framework. I'll show you the website really quick. It's a really minimalistic website. You can download it from here, and it's got some code, some examples, and some other stuff here. And here you can see that they have the columns laid out. So I've set up a small project. The project doesn't involve a lot of things here. Let me collapse that one. And the master page is the main setup here. And what I further did, I set up a less file. Is anybody familiar with less? Sort of. Okay. So less is basically a preprocessor for CSS. And it allows us to structure our CSS a bit better. So for instance, we can use variables inside a less file for a background color. Once we save the less file, it will be converted to a CSS, and it will replace all those variables, or all the places with those variables. And it will allow us to set up CSS more quickly. And it also allows us to set up to reuse CSS on various points. So this is actually one of the things why I use Web Essentials, because Web Essentials is able to compile this into CSS. So this is my less file where I will start with, and one of the things that you see here is that we can use nested CSS, and this will, once I save this, let me make a quick change here. You'll see that it will rearrange it. You see, so this is basically what less does. So it allows us to create CSS more quickly in a structured way. Another thing that we can do is we can use so-called mix-ins, which is pretty much like a CSS function. So if we want to have a drop shadow somewhere, I can call this particular less method here, and it will be rendered out with all the vendor-specific shadow CSS things here. And I just downloaded this file, and I'm just going to use it somewhere. So it's, yeah, it saves us quite a bit of time. You've got something else. You've got less. You've got sass, which is also like a CSS processor. I'm using less for this one, but it's pretty much the same. There are some small differences there. So I also installed, to speed up the coding part of this session, I have installed CodeBrush, and I prepared a couple of templates here. So I don't need to type too much code. So as I mentioned, I can import the mixins less file, so that will be included, and I will have the functions all available. I was talking about variables here. So I am declaring some for and some background colors here. You declare them by using the @ sign with a name. And if I take a look right now at the site that we're looking at, let me start this one up. Then we'll have a fairly simple site. Doesn't have any graphics yet. But it does have the responsive features. Okay, so what's going on here? All right. That is... Let me quickly convert that. Yeah, I had to install a new version of our own product, and I'm using the menu system that we have, so I need to quickly convert it to have the new version available here. Okay, you know what? I'm just going to remove the menu for now and deal with that a bit later. Just like this. All right, so here is my little site, and it doesn't do a lot yet. What you see here is that we have 3 blocks here. Well, the menu has been disappeared, but I'll get that back a bit later. But it already is responsive, because what happens here basically is there is something else that I should clear out here. And that is, I need to compile this one up new again. Yeah, okay, this looks better. Okay, so here we have a site. It doesn't look really good, but it does have some responsive features here. So I have laid down 3 content blocks about skeleton, 3 core principles, docs, and support. Once I resize the site, you'll see that those blocks will fall underneath each other at a certain dimension. So this is looking good on any device right now. Well, I do want to change a couple of things, because I've got this Hamburger menu, but I only want that Hamburger menu to appear once we are in that small mode. And I want to have the normal menu laid out in the current setting. I also want to replace this image by a logo, because, or this text by a logo, because it looks a bit better. And for that, I will implement a couple of CSS selectors on this H1, because if we take a look at the master page, in this case, I mean, this is web forms, but this can be used with MVC, whatever. It's just to lay out this stuff. So I want this to be found good, so I've made it a H1, but I'm going to put in a couple of things in my last file, which will replace that logo with some image. And I will be using an SVG version, and I will also be using a PNG version as a fallback mechanism. And I'm declaring a couple of variables here, so I can resize this. I'm going to use these Hamburger things a bit later on. And now I can replace the text, or I will position the text outside of the container, and I will replace the background with an image. And as you can see, I'm just using those variables here. And in this case, if I would save this file, save it again, you will see that I have this H1 replaced with an SVG in this case, because my browser supports SVG, and I've included Modernizer to determine whether that works or not. But what I also want to happen is that once I make this page smaller, that logo can be a bit smaller. So this is also one of the things that we can do for responsive web design. One of the things that is shipped with Skeleton as well as Twitter and the other frameworks is, if I go all the way down, we have a number of specific selectors here. And what this means, and this is basically the building blocks of responsive design. First, the top CSS is being applied. Next, the browser is going to check if any of these conditions apply to the current browser. And if that is the case, so if my minimum width is smaller as 550 pixels in this case, I will apply additionally CSS on top of the stuff that we already loaded. And how does that work, for instance? So if I add a bit of code here, the header, for instance, if my screen is small enough, I will apply additional CSS on that logo, and in this case I will make it float to the right, and I will scale down that logo. And I am using a mix-in that I created myself, so let me put that in here as well. And by the way, this code is available on GitHub, so you can download and play with it after the session. I want that logo to be scaled in proportionally, so it still looks good. So I've created my own little mix in here with less, and I will scale that logo accordingly. So if I save this, let me do this. If I save this one out and do a refresh here, what's happening if my screen gets smaller at a certain dimension, you'll see that the logo gets smaller and it's flipped over to the other side because of that additional CSS that I applied in that media query. That's what we call a media query. So yeah, you can do all kinds of stuff with that. I mean, I could even make it smaller if it's like even a smaller device. You can play around with that, and you can do all kinds of stuff with that. I also do want to have the navigation properly set up. I do have to keep a bit track of time, so I'm going to rush this on. I'm going to make the navigation look a bit better here. And there are a couple of interesting things here that I do. I have a normal tag specified and I have a compact tag specified. And I have those also specified. Maybe you noticed it already. I specified it as well in the media queries here. So basically everything which has the normal tag applied will be displayed once the screen is bigger as 549 pixels. Everything which has the compact style applied will have the will be visible only when you are looking at it on a small screen. And what we can do with this is, let me see if I included everything I wanted to include for this stage. Yeah, so what we see here, I left out the menu. There should be a couple of menu items in here, but I left it out because that little version conflict. Once I make it smaller, you'll see that the Hamburger menu will appear. So how did that happen? Well, if we take a look at the markup here, I have decorated something here. So this is a div which I decorated with the normal tag or the normal selector. And here I decorated something with the compact. I also included one of those icon fonts, and this is the way how you can use one of those icon fonts. Yeah, one of those icons. There is this span, and I gave it a icon dash menu, which comes out of my fonts, which I downloaded from iCommun in this case. It's got all the CSS for that. So if I specify a span with an icon dash menu, it will show that Hamburger menu. If I would have that font to be bigger, if I want the Hamburger menu to be bigger, I can just do some additional styling here. And I can say font size. I'm not sure if this is going to look good. If I now switch over and refresh the page. You'll have a bigger Hamburger menu. So this is one of the things how you can make bigger icons with the icon fonts by just specifying the font size. it's got a blue dash underneath it, and that is because it's an anchor, and I didn't say text decoration is none, so it's underlined here. So that is in a nutshell how we can apply certain CSS rules on specific screens. Well, the last thing in this little demo that I want to show is that because the navigation changes, what I would like to happen is that if I am on a small screen and I click this hamburger, I want to have a menu slide out from the side and have the navigation there, what you saw at the site that I was showing you. How we can do this is actually also pretty straightforward. I'll switch back to my slide deck first to show what we're going to do to get that hamburger menu slide out. So what we can do here is I'll put a div on the left side of my screen. And I'm going to give it a position absolute, so I can give it a minimum height of 100 VH. That's like a relative measurement. And I can have a width, and in the current position, it will have a width of 0 pixels. So it will basically not be visible. Then I would like to animate it out. So I want to ease out that menu. I don't want it to appear like there, but I want to have it animated. And for that, I will use something which is called a CSS transition to make the width of this hamburger menu, in this case 250 pixels. So I will change the width to 250, but I will also set up a couple of CSS transition specifiers, so it will animate out really nice. We don't need any JavaScript for the animation, it will just be handled by CSS. We will only need a bit of JavaScript to activate the menu, but that is also not too difficult to achieve. So if I go back, I need to implement that div first, and again I prepared a bit of code here. So this is going to be the menu, the side menu, and I need some CSS here as well. Let's put that in. The side menu will have basically the stuff that I have been specifying in the slide deck. So we'll have a width of 0, it will have a position absolute, because if we don't put a position absolute, you can't use the Z index to make it go up to the front. And then I will use the transition specifiers. And this is something which is done by CSS, and I'm using a mix-in from that other file here. But what it basically specifies is that if I change by any means the width property of this particular CSS selector, I want to ease it out. I want to use this animation effect, and it needs to happen in 500 milliseconds. So whether I change it by Firebug or whether I change it by JavaScript, it will use that animation to ease out that width. So I will make it wider. And that's actually a pretty cool feature with CSS. You don't need any sophisticated JavaScript to do so. You can just specify this in CSS and it will happen. I will furthermore specify a couple of other things which need to happen to have that menu look good. And I will have an additional selector set up. So if I decorate something outside of the side menu with this tag, and I can use jQuery to add a tag to, for instance, the body element of the page, then it will change the width of the menu to 250 pixels in this case. And because I specified the transition specifier right here, that is just going to happen. So let me do a couple of things to see that I didn't forget anything here. I put that one up, I put that one up. So let's see what happens if I go back to my page. Let's make the hamburger menu slightly smaller. It's being a bit big right now, which was over here. And I put that one here. Okay, so here it is. Well, I can tell you that the div is here, but nothing is happening. So I need to click this button, and then something needs to happen. I'm going to put a bit of JavaScript inside this file. I did that. I prepared it also already. I will start with this menu function. So I will just have a JavaScript function, Hamburger visible. And what it does, it adds a class to the body. And in this case, it will show left Hamburger menu. So in other words, if I would go here to the developer tools, and I would add that manually. Let me make that slightly bigger, like this. I would go to the particular HTML. Let me make that also slightly bigger. So in this case, the body tag doesn't have that. So let me copy that. Let me have a quick check here. Show left Hamburger menu it was. I can now add an attribute, which is going to be class is show left Hamburger menu. You saw the menu pop up, and it was nice and smooth. So what I basically did, I just added the show left Hamburger menu, and all the CSS was applied accordingly. So basically what the JavaScript needs to do is add that thing to the HTML. So I set up a couple of small helper methods here. I did some support for a right side Hamburger menu as well, but in that case you can figure that out yourself. You need to have a div on the other side which has a width of 0 pixels in the beginning, but then you have to change as well the left position and the width of the right side Hamburger menu, but we'll not be dealing with that in this session because of time, obviously. And I have to really keep going on the code because I also want to tell you a bit about Bootstrap. So what I've done is I've set up a couple of methods here which will bind click events to everything which has a data navigate action in the HTML. And I prepared that obviously already. So the Hamburger menu has a data navigate action, and that will toggle Hamburger left. Just like that. So if I switch back here, save this JavaScript and reload my page, let me close this one down. We'll have the page again. Here's the Hamburger menu. And here you go. So this is basically, in a nutshell, how you could apply stuff like this with a minimum amount of JavaScript, but with a bit of styling. I also did change a couple of, added a orientation change as well, and that means that once I resize the window, I put the width of the menu on 0 and it goes off. And that has been done by binding this code basically. So I bind it to an orientation change or resize, and then I will just hide out those hamburgers. So that is in a nutshell what we can do to make responsive sites. And okay, getting to Bootstrap. So why is Bootstrap so popular these days? Well, a lot of things that I have been doing, like for instance, if I go back to my CSS, I pulled in a couple of tricks like, for instance, I used something like the compact class and the normal class. So everything what is decorated with a normal class, in my case, will be visible on the desktop. Everything which is decorated with a compact class will be visible on a smaller device. Well, Bootstrap has way more of those features specified, and that is something which makes it really easy to use. So if I check out the Bootstrap grid, it's the same as we have. So we've got the columns, just like we had on Skeleton. We have the rows with elements. But the most interesting things here is that they have quite a bunch of predefined class names. I hope you can read it, actually. So, for instance, they have a col LG4. What that means is on a big device, it will span 4 columns. LG stands for large. And they have a whole bunch of predefined classes which allows you only need to decorate certain elements and it will be visible or non-visible depending on those prefixes in those class names. So you don't need to pull those tricks. So that is one of the things, obviously, why Bootstrap is really easy to use, because you don't have to put in those normal and compact tricks yourself. And well, what we can do is, for instance, this is a bit of code concerning Bootstrap. This is how it looks, and I also put in a Bootstrap page here. So if I quickly go to this particular page, you will see that there is some stuff going on here about the tricks that I have been pulling off earlier. So that's all out of the box, it works. So if I look it up on a small device, you'll have a Hamburger menu, or you have the menu. And I personally don't like this this kind of thing. I like the slide out more, but you could apply the same code on this Bootstrap enabled site as well. And if I resize this, you'll see that everything is changing again, but that is because they have all those predefined styles already, and they're awesome documented. So there is no need to fumble around in the CSS of Bootstrap. You can just look that up on the documentation, which styles are available. And again, I mean, the same principles apply. If I make it smaller, you'll see that all those elements are being put down to each other. So, and with Bootstrap 4 coming out, it's got even more of those features available, and it works even faster and that kind of stuff. So that is one of the reasons why Bootstrap is doing a good job on all those responsive features. And well, what I could specify out here is that I could add like an additional class here. So if I make like a call LG, I don't know, 8, and I make this one call LG 2, for instance. And again, this needs to add up to 12 because of the number of columns of the grid. Then it should behave differently on a bigger screen. So I was just putting in a couple of things. I think it should be. Yeah, so here you'll see that if I put it on a big screen, that this one is way bigger as the other two. And that was because of the additional tags that I only needed to add those tags. So if you know the tags and their meanings, you can do all kinds of tricks here. So that is why Bootstrap is quite popular these days, because they've got all of out-of-the-box CSS available for you. And let me close down this session right on time with, if you have any questions, feel free to ask, or come down to our booth and ask questions there. I would like to thank you so far.